Get started here. Hi, everyone. Welcome. You're in research applications at the intersection of ecosystem and community resilience. Thank you so much for being here. It's a great turnout. We've got a great group of speakers here for you today to talk about and highlight some collaborative efforts around climate impacts to our coastal ecosystems and communities in North Carolina and across the region that'll really look at how best available science and data is being incorporated throughout the process, and also working to really bridge that gap between research and needs and decision making on the ground. So we'll just go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Well, actually, I should back up and do a little bit of housekeeping. So some things to keep in mind. So we'll have 4 speakers. We'll have about 5 minutes or so for questions at the end of each person's presentation. So be thinking about any questions you have as we go through. And then that should also leave us some time at the end for any additional burning questions and to quickly wrap up. For the sake of our online attendees, if we have any today, we will all try to speak into microphones. So that means that I will be running around to field your questions. So when we get to that point, just raise your hand, I can come over to you. You can also feel free to just stand up and head to the back microphone, which we have available if anybody is interested and it's more convenient geographically in the room, but I'm happy to come to you. I think for the sake of the order, that's all we have. So we're going to kick off with Smiley and Helena Garcia. They're going to tell us about a Sea Grant funded student-led project they're working on, an interdisciplinary approach to quantifying flood mitigating ecosystem services and identifying who benefits in New Bern.
Thanks, Cayla. Okay. How are you guys? Good. Well, I'm Smiley. I'm a grad student at UNC-Chapel Hill in the Department of Earth, Marine, and Environmental Sciences.
And I'm Helena Garcia. I'm also a grad student at Chapel Hill, and I'm in the Environment, Energy, and Ecology program.
And we're really excited to share with you this interdisciplinary student-led project that involves direct collaboration with city officials in New Bern that's all focused on quantifying flood mitigating ecosystem services and identifying the beneficiaries. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of New Bern, I want to talk about the coastal zone more generally. So 30% of the United States population lives in coastal counties, and those only make up about 10% of our land area. And that percentage is growing, which isn't necessarily surprising. I don't think I need to convince this crowd why the coast is awesome, right? We dedicated our lives and careers to it. But this population growth at the coast isn't going to come without risk. We're going to see increased exposure to coastal hazards. And as North Carolinians, we're pretty familiar with hurricanes and subsequent floods as a coastal hazard. We experience them pretty frequently. And in recent decades, it seems as though we have experienced them more frequently than ever before. So much so that some experts, including this handful of UNC marine scientists, suggest we've entered a new regime of storm activity that's ushered in by climate change. So we're seeing these high magnitude events happen at higher frequencies, and their characteristics are sort of shifting. For example, we're seeing increased precipitation. In North Carolina, hurricanes Floyd, Matthew, and Florence, they were all high precipitation events that made landfall and caused floods resulting in 2% or less annual exceedance levels. And that just means that in the span of 20 years, 3 hurricanes produce floods that we would only expect to see once every 50 years. So that's significant and somewhat alarming, and probably why coastal cities like New Bern have this sort of newfound emphasis on resilience. And New Bern actually released their new resiliency and hazard mitigation plan earlier this year in January. And that follows Hurricane Florence, which made landfall in September of 2018. And New Bern is one of the towns that experienced really catastrophic effects of that storm, where they estimated about 4,300 homes and 300 businesses that were damaged, costing about $100 million. And I bring that up because Hurricane Florence is sort of a focal point of this project, and we'll be talking about it in the next few slides. Okay, so Helena, myself, and many others have been working on this as a part of this large team that's led by Dr. Elizabeth Frankenberg, the plenary speaker from earlier today, on the projects, The Dynamics of Extreme Events, People, and Places. And this project is a really interdisciplinary effort that tries to understand the social, environmental, and engineered aspects that are contributing to coastal resilience in Eastern North Carolina more broadly. And from this group, we identified several of us that were interested specifically in New Bern because it's interesting for social, environmental, and engineered reasons. And thus the New Bern Living Lab Working Group was born. We have a few faculty advisors, Miyuki, Phil, Antonia, and they're awesome. But I did mention at the beginning, I'd be talking about the student-led project. So I'm going to spend just a minute talking about the students and our efforts on this team. It's sort of like a microcosm of the larger deep macrocosm in its interdisciplinarity. I'm an environmental scientist. I look at ecosystem functions and try to quantify those. Lauren Grimley, she's the engineer on our team. She's developed a computational compound flood model. So she accounts for riverine, pluvial, and coastal processes that impact New Bern. Helena does amazing work on community plan integration, and she also works with the socio-demographic data. And we also have an undergraduate on our team who is a part of the household survey for the DEEP project. So she actually was on the ground in New Bern talking to residents about their experiences during hurricanes and how their lives were disrupted or impacted. So if you're interested in that aspect of this project, please go check out her poster later today at 5.
Great, and so another huge part of our team is the City of New Bern itself. So we've been fortunate to establish relationships with people in the planning and public works departments in the city. And this has really helped us as a team shape our research objectives to align with the city's resilience goals. So part of their resilience pillars from their recent plan that Anne mentioned earlier, we specifically see our work supporting the resilience pillar that focuses on the natural resources in the city. So how are we planning to do this? Our project specifically looks at how ecosystem services are integrated into flood resilience planning in New Bern. While we each have a lot of different research questions based on our own research interests, today we're going to focus on the 3 that are here on this slide, looking at how land cover and flood hazards influence the supply of flood mitigating ecosystem services that are in New Bern. And then we're going to talk about how these ecosystem services are being planned for. And we'll also talk about some of our work with the city itself. So something that we have struggled with as a team and are currently still working on is trying to get all of our different data from our subdisciplines to speak with each other. So how we've been doing that is trying to convert our data into one common unit of analysis. So I work with census data, for example, which comes in block groups and tracts, and then Anne's data is much better understood at a watershed scale. So as a team, we've delineated these subbasins across the New Bern area here on the left, and we're using these to convert our other data so that, again, they can speak to each other. And this allows us to make the assumption that the ecosystem services available in one subbasin are benefiting the people who reside and live in that subbasin.
Okay. So our first research question has to do with land cover and flood hazard and its impact on the supply of flood mitigating ecosystem services. And the 2 that we're really interested in are flood attenuation and water quality regulation. I'm going to talk about the water quality piece, specifically regulation through nitrogen removal. And I just briefly want to say nitrogen in excess in aquatic systems is hazardous in that it can fuel nuisance algal blooms. Sometimes they're toxic, so negative implications for public health. We've seen these blooms result in anoxia or depletion of oxygen in the water column, and also fish kills. Another thing, excess nitrogen has been linked to habitat degradation in marshes and seagrass beds. So too much nitrogen in an aquatic system can be bad. And the removal through natural mechanisms and processes is a really valuable ecosystem function. So what we do is we combine some field work with some laboratory experiments to simulate flooded conditions and measure nitrogen removal from a bunch of different types of green spaces. And then we layer that data on top of some GIS techniques, and we look at where these green spaces are located relative to people. So thinking about land cover in the context of that subbasin unit of spatial analysis, here we've mapped the fraction of green space within each subbasin, and you can see that it's heterogeneously distributed. There are pockets of high density green space. There are areas where there are lower density green spaces, so like in the downtown area right there. And this is helpful. It provides some insight into the distribution of ecosystem services broadly. But what we can do is take those experimentally measured values and map exactly where potential nitrogen removal could be happening at the subbasin scale. And they match pretty well. There are some nitrogen removal hotspots that correlate spatially with the high density green space areas, but it's not exact. And that's because not all green spaces are removing nitrogen the same. And that just has some implications on quality of ecosystem services. And like I said before, so our experiments, they simulate flooded conditions. So this is potential nitrogen removal as if the whole landscape were underwater. But what we can do is take Lauren's compound flood model, overlay on our landscape, and then calculate the nitrogen that was probably removed during Hurricane Florence. And this is really cool because what we've done is taken the data that we have and we've quantified, we've modeled the supply of this ecosystem service during a specific event. And the next step for this would be like thinking about who lives in these subbasins, what are the socio-demographic characteristics of the people that are benefiting from these ecosystem services, or maybe thinking about these areas that were flooded but maybe didn't receive the ecosystem services because it's built up, or areas where it was flooded and there were hotspots of nitrogen removal. So thinking about ecosystems' impact on people, but then also, Helena's going to talk about this, people's impact on the distribution of green spaces and ecosystem services. So that could be through land use planning and policies. One example would be Jack Smith Creek here, which is a stormwater wetland that they designed, and we see they got this ecosystem service, and it's a hotspot for nitrogen removal. And Helena's going to talk more about this project.
Okay, so next I'm going to talk about how we look at plans and determine if they are benefiting and creating more ecosystem services through green space. So we do this using an established plan evaluation method called the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard. And basically, we look at a sample network of plans that could exist in really any community, and we identify the policies that are spatially explicit, so we know where they are working, and then we look at how those policies might have an outcome that could increase or decrease flood exposure. So for example, a policy that buys and acquires land and puts it into conservation in the 100-year hazard flood area would be one that receives a score of +1 because it's decreasing flood exposure. But a policy functioning in that same area that proposes to build more would receive a score of -1. So because we're interested in looking at ecosystems, we've kind of modified this scoring tool to look at how policies are either degrading or promoting healthy ecosystems around New Bern. So here we have a maximum positive score of 2 to help differentiate between policies that are prioritizing green space versus ones that restore wetlands and create new high quality habitat that we know have more ecosystem service potential. So here is one way we can look at the results of this across our 7 plans in New Bern. So here on the far left in the purple, we're seeing that the land use and comprehensive plan has 54 policies that prioritize ecosystems and benefit the ecosystem services and the supply in New Bern. But we're seeing in other plans, like the neighborhood plans and the transportation plan, that there are policies that are prioritizing development over ecosystems. And we should note that just because they're negative in this framework doesn't mean that they're bad policies. A lot of these policies are actually working in vulnerable communities to promote more economic and equitable development for socially vulnerable communities. Another way that we can look at our PERS or the scorecard results is by looking at the net scores of policies across all of our plans at our sub-basin scale. So here we're seeing that for the ecosystem services scoring scheme. And basically we're seeing again this area where the Jack Smith Creek stormwater project is benefiting ecosystems and has a really high score in this scoring tool. And we were lucky enough as a team to be able to go on the ground with people in New Bern to learn more about this area and walk around and see where they're planning on expanding the wetlands in the downtown area. And one thing that our teammate Lauren, who is not here, has been able to do is work with the people in New Bern to identify places to put stormwater sensors in storm drains. And so we see a map of where those are in New Bern down here on the right. And this is part of the Sunny Day Flooding Project, which is a bigger part of the DEEP project that Anne mentioned earlier. And what's interesting is we get water level observations here, but we also get pictures. So this is a picture, an example from one of the sensors recently in Hurricane Ian. Here in the picture on the left, we see flooding on the street. A car is actually going through it. And then more recently on a normal day, that's what it usually looks like. So we have a number of next steps as a team, but our first big one is quantifying our other ecosystem service of flood attenuation. And we're all really interested to see if there are trade-offs between the two ecosystem services we're looking at spatially in New Bern. My next step specifically is to downscale some of our socio-demographic data, again, getting it from those census block groups unit of analysis to subbasins using, for example, like the residential parcel data in New Bern. And we're also specifically interested in two social vulnerability indicators of median household income and the share of Black residents in households within each subbasin. And once we have all of our data in the subbasin scale, we are looking forward to identifying the relationships that exist between ecosystem service supply and our different socio-demographic metrics, and also the degree to which people saw flooding during Hurricane Florence. And then finally, again, our teammate Jackie has a poster more on the household survey in New Bern specifically, but we're all really interested in learning about how people answered the questions about how they perceive ecosystem services helping mitigate their flood exposure in their area. And with that, we're happy to take any of your questions.
Ooh, there it is. Any questions for Anne or Helena? Coming to you. We have time for a couple, and if there are any others that come to mind, we'll have plenty of time. Oh, that's fine. I enjoyed reading.
Very nice presentation. Thanks to you both. I was wondering about the +1, -1 scoring of developed or not developed.
Yeah.
And in that not all development is equal. Yeah. And I was just wondering if you have an idea of how to address that, or maybe it doesn't need to be addressed. Just curious.
Yeah, so basically we look at, so for example, if there are ordinances in certain areas that like elevate but build in that area, that would not receive a -1. So we're looking to see if they're taking provisions to mitigate the exposure with some of like the building codes and ordinances.
Time for one more question right now, if anyone has one. John.
Great presentation. I'm just curious, how do you take this beyond New Bern?
Well, good question. So I think there are coastal cities all over the place that are experiencing increased flood hazard because of climate change, increased frequency and intensity of storms. So I think our calculations or our methods to map the supply of ecosystem services can be applied across coastal areas everywhere. And I think that our framework for communicating with city officials in New Bern, it's been so positive and they've been so receptive to our work. Like now that framework is in place that we can translate that to other coastal areas. I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, I think also, so our teammate Lauren, her compound flood model is for beyond New Bern also. Like for example, in my case though, since I look at plans, usually cities and have more planning happening than in rural areas, but I do think that's something we're interested in, like looking at the incorporated versus unincorporated areas around New Bern and how that might mean that certain policies are in place in some places, but not others.
All right. Next up, we have Curtis Smalling with Audubon NC, and he'll be talking to you a little bit about the Coastal Carolinas Blueprint and integrating social vulnerability into regional conservation planning.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate everybody surviving lunch and coming and hopefully not falling asleep during my talk. I do want to put just a little caveat right at the beginning. I'm going to talk to you today about a mapping product that was prepared for our North and South Carolina, Coastal Carolinas initiative. But like all decision support tools, right, it's just the first step. We've taken the next step of looking at a lot of the things that were mentioned in the last presentation. How do we take a model that incorporates social vulnerability, but then also dig very much deeper? We're using things like the EJ screening tool and other things to really parse out what our top priorities are. Those incorporated towns? Are those the rural areas, unincorporated areas outside? And we've made a lot of progress and frankly already prepared a number of funding proposals and stuff around that, right, that are a follow-on from this work. So I just want to highlight that, that all of these fairly sophisticated modeling efforts and stuff then somebody has to convert that into on the ground stuff, right? And hopefully it helps inform us to be more proactive and more kind of thoughtful about how we're doing that. So I have the luxury of, focusing on a mission critical taxonomic group, right? Audubon is about birds. And so when we think about how do we do our conservation planning, it's driven by that goal, right? And most of us here, we've had a lot of discussions today about kind of overall system health and that kind of stuff, but almost every group comes at this with a particular priority, whether it's fisheries or human health or whatever. So I just throw that out there because, we built this model to inform our priority. Audubon has produced a number of these nationwide that reflect our kind of our priorities in different geographic areas. They provide us with some strategic direction, but also really focus on birds and how we create co-benefits, right? We all have this toolbox of things that we can do whenever we're focused on our priorities, but we have choice points on how we apply those and which ones are most appropriate to create those co-benefits. So keep that in mind as we go through. This particular blueprint process had several pretty specific goals. Audubon, North Carolina already manages about 40% of the state's colonial nesting water birds and beach birds. We would like for our goals, and I won't read these, but to really highlight that species resilience. There's a whole body of work about species resilience as well, things like how much isolation and modularity and connectivity and all those things connect those different populations of the species you're interested in. So we really want to form this protected network. So kind of the where are we trying to protect those species? But we really, as an organization, have fully embraced this need to elevate the frontline communities who often share these spaces with these priority places for birds. And so this process was really to help us start to get a handle on how we might do that more effectively. We really wanted to maximize, our investments and our resources and put those in places where we could do the best for birds and for frontline communities. We also, with this project, want to evaluate, so what does that mean? We do a lot of conservation planning, have done for 100 years, right, with Audubon. How does putting frontline communities kind of front and center, is there an effect? Does that affect where we decide to work? And if it does affect it, how does it affect it, right? So I'll have just a couple of slides. I will say, when they share the slide deck, I hid some slides in the interest of time, but those will be in that deck, and they go a little bit deeper in some of the metrics and comparisons that I'm just going to touch on briefly today. So the spatial extent of this project was the coastal regions of North and South Carolina, essentially the Marsh migration corridor, kind of a TNC product. That was our starting point. We focused nationally on the coastal Carolinas for a number of reasons. One is that a huge percentage of our population is affected by coastal and climate issues. Audubon has capacity in both of these states that are currently working at the coast. And the species that we're interested in are highly prioritized for this part of the world, right? Every conservation plan calls out our sound systems and all those kinds of things as really important places for this biodiversity. The approach we took was kind of a really basic complementarity-based optimization, where you just layer on your goal things, the individual species, where they occur, where they nest, what does your community social vulnerability look like, what does the landscape condition look like, and you just basically start to use essentially a zonal approach, right? Where you start pulling out pixels and saying which ones have the lowest rank. You start pulling those off. And as you go through, then you can stratify that to top 10%, top 30%, whatever. So you're removing the least value cells and building your way up to the cells that have the maximum scores. Fortunately for Audubon, we produced a really intensively large climate-based scenario for birds, modeled over 600 species in North America and predicted what they would look like in 2050, 2080, and 2100. And so we had this present and future scenario on the bird data, which is pretty robust. We also wanted to measure some social vulnerability. We used the SVI index, the social vulnerability index. And then landscape condition, and we have several things that went into that model. So basically produced two models, one at present value, one at the future value, and then compare the two. And it basically parses an individual pixel into one of four categories, right? So if it's high present use or high score now, predicted to stay high into the future, that's a place we want to protect or maintain. If it's a place that's good now, but expected to degrade due to climate impacts, then we want to kind of do some adaptation strategies there. If it's low performing now, but expected to get better, then we want to do some restoration work to kind of drive that. Think about things like marsh migration and ghost forest, those kinds of things. And then if it is one of those early cells that came out is not very high scoring, then it's a low priority area. These are just a few of the things that went into the inputs. I'm not going to read through this, things that most of you who do any GIS work are familiar with, right? So landscape condition in particular is human modification index, a number of kind of index kinds of layers that went into the model. For the social vulnerability, a lot of times social vulnerability in the classic conservation context, especially land protection context, was always used as a kind of a least cost path model, right? You look for the cheapest land and the biggest tracts and you go buy that first. That often has a pretty detrimental effect on frontline communities and under-wealth communities. So we kind of inverted that. So frontline communities that have low value, land value, have high proportion of people of color, people with English as their second language, all those kind of SVI index things score higher. So it drives the model to those places instead of away from those places. Again, we dug in deeper after we produced the full two-state model. We did want to evaluate, though, does that have an effect on the outcome, right? Normally we think about, we pick the best places for birds, pick the best habitats on the landscape, and we go work to protect those and maintain those. So we ran this model kind of four different ways: birds by themselves, birds and people, birds and habitat, and then all three together. What we found was kind of interesting. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We were looking at 7,000 square kilometers of stuff to look at, but some interesting things came out. One is that if you just, the chart on the left looks at the species top 30% representation. It captures really well the social vulnerability piece, the birds and people piece. But when you throw in habitat condition, it starts to negate the effect of those a little bit. What it typically means is that it's driving you toward the most pristine places, and often the frontline communities don't live in those most pristine places, right? They'll often live adjacent to those most pristine places in danger of flooding and all the rest of it. But the social vulnerability model, so the community metric on its own, obviously scores the highest when it's just the birds community piece. But when you throw in condition, it basically negates the positive impact of putting the social vulnerability metrics in there. And so some of the lessons learned is, social vulnerability as a cost layer can be really effective at driving us toward those communities. But if we place a high premium on intact habitat condition and future habitat condition, it can negate that drive toward including frontline communities. So just bear that in mind. These effects are pretty bifurcated to urban versus rural too. So it tends to be pretty site specific. So just keep that in mind as you're messing with models. We don't want to negate good intentions with good intentions on the habitat side too. It points us to this notion that we need to co-create the solutions, right? Which is what we're trying to do. The other lesson to learn, I think, is, you know, and this is a little bit of editorializing, so I forgive me, this is not part of the study, but we have seen as we've tried to raise money for capacity in these places, a number of funders are and we're all figuring this out, right? I mean, I think the thing we've seen so far today, and we'll see tomorrow, is we're all figuring this out. We've been told directly, just go pick a place, just commit, just go pick a place. What this model allows us to do is say, we're going to pick like 12 places and build some relationships and take some time and figure out where the Venn diagrams actually make sense, right? And we need to give each other the space to like do that. I joke with my colleagues and say, we give our development staff like 20 years to make the big ask of somebody. But when we're working in new communities that we don't have a natural fit with, we want the 18-month grant cycle to deliver, right? So we've got to give ourselves the space to build authentic relationships. And if my bird priority doesn't overlap with your community priority, then that's fine. And we can help each other where we can help each other, but I'm not going to go in and say, I've got to build this thing for my birds. And sorry, your community doesn't have foot access to bank fishing in this part of the river anymore. I'm just sorry. We just can't do that anymore. We have been guilty of that in the past, so we don't want to do that anymore. There were a lot of folks who worked on this, and as I said, there are a number of other slides that go into the way that the social vulnerability index and the interplay between the three categories affect the ultimate scores. When they share the full deck, you'll have access to those and can see those a little bit clearer. I would say though that it's been really interesting for us to work on birds because they are widely distributed, but they're very specific, especially at the coast, on where they want to be. And so this interplay between those really strict habitat standards with a human dimension is both challenging, but also a real opportunity for engagement. A lot of folks really care about that wildlife that they see every day. And really engage around it. So I really appreciate your time. I'll be glad to take some questions. Yep.
Fit goes, there we go. Okay, thanks Curtis, that was great. Any questions? Oh, see a hand.
So it's my understanding that the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index is in itself a weighted model that is to an extent like kind of arbitrary. Are there any other kind of social vulnerability indices that they're looking at or like planning to look at to substitute for or like accompany your model?
Yeah, so what we did was basically let the model with the social vulnerability index kind of drive the big model, much like they did. Then we parsed that model down to a 12-digit HUC scale and weighted those and said, okay, for the North Carolina piece of it, what's the top 10% of performing HUCs, right? Which should capture top bird places, top social vulnerability, top habitat quality at some level, knowing that they do affect each other, right? But then we dug into those using census block data, tapestry data from ESRI, and the EJ screening tool, which is pretty good if you don't zoom in too tight, right? If you get below a census block, then it's a little wonky. But it is good at parsing out potential like population estimates for unincorporated areas, that kind of stuff. So we used all three of those kind of again. Once we collapsed it to this kind of top 10% of HUCs, then we looked deeper. And what we found, and actually for North Carolina, just to give you the long-winded answer, the Albemarle Pamlico Peninsula obviously lights up on everybody's map for everything, right? So those top 10 HUCs in that region 2 of them were really white dominated. They were poor, but they were white dominated. So then we had some decision points to make, right? So we've got this other HUC in Tyrell County that's 56% people of color, right? So when we're trying to decide where we're going to work, it ultimately comes down to these, you know, what everybody calls choice points. Like you have to decide where you're going to invest and where you're going to put the capacity. And so one of Audubon's primary goals is to be more intentional and to engage those communities. So the choice point is this HUC goes away and this one becomes a priority. Now, it's not saying we're going to go do every tool in our toolbox there, right? Because what it does is point us to where we're going to start to develop relationships and see where those authentic connections are. And there, you know, I come from a smaller community, and you know, sometimes a sewage lift station is the most important piece of infrastructure you want, and you don't really care if you've got a functional marsh out there. Like, I need my lift station to get rid of my sewage, right? Like, we get that. Especially when people are like, "Oh, you're the bird guy," right? Like, and we all have those, right? I'm the plant guy, or I'm the fish guy, or whatever. I think you just have to listen really intently and say, where do those priorities overlap? We talk about this in our bird-friendly community work a lot. Like, almost any piece of habitat, even a Walmart parking lot, I hate to say it, can be better, right? The plantings in the traffic circles can be better than they are. So if we start from that point and say, I'm not just going to work in the best places, I'm going to work where the intersection is authentic, and then we can make progress and work together. So, thank you.
Got a couple more minutes. Any other questions? Also, Curtis, I'm going to steal choice points. Love that term. Any additional questions from the audience? Last thoughts?
Okay.
All right. Round of applause. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Let me get you set up. All right. You should be good. Introduce you from over here. All right, now we got Adam Gold with Environmental Defense Fund. Talk to us a little bit about the flood resiliency blueprint and our state's journey to flood resilience.
Awesome. Thanks, Cayla. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Just full disclosure, I've only been at EDF for about a month. So like Curtis was saying, the bird guy, I'm the stormwater pond guy, but now I'm transitioning to the natural infrastructure guy. So that's a new term instead of nature-based, natural infrastructure. And also like to point out the difference in the title between what's up here and in your program. It's with natural infrastructure. So let's get started. So today I'm just going to give a brief overview of North Carolina's recent flooding and response, which I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with at this point. I'm going to do a brief overview as well of natural infrastructure for flood mitigation. And then finally, some emerging natural infrastructure research topics that we've kind of been thinking of in our group at EDF. Just to share with y'all and maybe spur some discussion either during the questions or if you want to talk with me afterwards, that would be great. Okay, so first up, as everyone's aware at this point, we had widespread flooding from 2 hurricanes in 2016 and 2018. And so the map on the left is showing in North Carolina where we have the 100-year and 500-year floodplains, as well as the floodways. And then in panel B on the right, we have observed flooding from satellite imagery, from radar imagery. And basically, where you had a floodplain, there was flooding. And so there was very severe impacts. And just to visualize this, we have some aerial imagery from Goldsboro, North Carolina, before and after, as well as Princeville, and then Greenville, finally. So this kind of severe impact spurred a lot of action at the state level. We have the creation of NCORE, so that's the Rebuild NC logo you see in the middle, as well as the Resilient Coastal Communities Program, as well as the RISE program. So a lot of action going on to address this issue and increase resiliency at the state level. We also have through executive order, the Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan that you see on the right. So getting kind of the best available science and curating it, and what are the impacts for North Carolina now and moving forward. And what we're seeing, a lot of people are interested in flooding, as you can see from the, if I can get this pointer to work. We have our word cloud right here, and this is a response of top climate hazard issues facing coastal North Carolina. So flooding is really top of mind in this area. Fast forward a little bit to present day, the North Carolina Flood Resiliency Blueprint is under development. And this will be a statewide watershed planning effort. So basically a statewide model at fairly high resolution where any community can go online with the decision support tool and see what their local flood risk is through multiple sources of flooding. So you have your rainfall-driven flooding, coastal flooding through surge, as well as riverine flooding. And we're excited about this because we believe it'll address issues of limited local capacity. So like I said, anyone can go on, even if you don't have the time and resources to have someone specifically focused on watershed planning in your community, you can get some really great info and be more successful in getting funding in the future. And also like to highlight $300 million set aside for innovative stormwater projects by the General Assembly. So there's this big pot of money for communities to access to implement natural infrastructure projects to address flooding. All right, so just a little bit about what natural infrastructure is, what that kind of large, broad term is. Basically, it's green infrastructure, it's nature-based infrastructure. It's mimicking real habitats and their processes and ecosystem services that they provide to us. And so on the right here, we have kind of a schematic, a cross-section of a hypothetical river. Might be a little hard to see, but we have living shoreline down here, oyster reefs, mangroves or marshes in North Carolina. So these are structures that would be effective at preventing or lowering wave heights and damage and erosion along the coast. And then moving further inland, kind of in our intercoastal plain area, you might have bioswales and rain gardens, so kind of that green or low impact development, kind of soaking up those floodwaters as opposed to just end of pipe solutions that get the water out as quickly as possible. And that's kind of what we see over here in the bottom left. We have a hypothetical hydrograph, which is on the x-axis we have time during a hypothetical storm event, and then we have the rate of flow through a hypothetical stream. So with A right here, you might have a lot of impervious surfaces upstream. You might have some ag upstream in the watershed, and you're getting really high peak flows that are overbanking and maybe causing some flooding or erosive issues downstream. But when you implement natural infrastructure or nature-based infrastructure, you're trying to lower that peak flow to reduce that damage, kind of restoring the hydrology to what it was pre-development, and also decreasing risk while you're at it. And so one practice that's kind of gaining popularity when thinking about addressing riverine flooding within the intercoastal plain, where we saw some really severe impacts from our hurricanes recently, is water farming. And so this is the idea of taking low yield cropland or cropland that is exposed to flooding regularly and installing a berm around it to just detain that flood water and take that peak flow down a little bit. And so the key here is that there's an outlet control structure. And so when you're expecting a big storm event, close that outlet structure and just retain that water for about a day. And then another idea is also using flood storage wetlands. So kind of a similar idea on cropland, but instead you're using the existing drainage ditch, you're widening it, and then installing an embankment and outlet to kind of just store those floodwaters for a little bit. And so we have a good idea that this is effective at the watershed scale, thanks to some research by Barbara Dahl and her group in 2020. And I'll have these slides available to share later, and all these sources are linked. So if you click on that, it'll take you right to the paper. But they were interested in looking at the efficacy of natural infrastructure to reduce flooding at the watershed scale. And this is in the Stony Creek watershed in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And in this particular situation, residents that lived down here in the more developed urban land use, they were losing access to the local hospital during fairly small storm events. So there was road overtopping and they couldn't get where they needed to go. And so the idea was, can we use natural infrastructure, model it to see if reforestation, storage, or a combination of these two natural infrastructure practices, can those be effective and kind of restore access to that hospital? And what they found is that when you're putting natural infrastructure within the watershed at pretty large rates, pretty high rates, you're getting a large reduction in the peak flow. So here is a 500-year storm or 500-year return period, and doing both reforestation and temporary detention on the landscape, you're seeing a 28% reduction in those peak flows. And this has kind of continued into the North Carolina Collaboratory 2021 Flood Resilience Study, which is a great study. So if you have not looked through it, highly recommend taking a look at that and seeing all the great research in there about a wide range of different topics related to flooding. But through this study, Barb Dahl and her team, there's been a few publications out of this as well recently. They found that there's high suitability, especially in the lower Middle Neuse Basin, for natural infrastructure implementation, and it had a really high localized impact at reducing peak flow. So up to 45% peak flow reduction. It's like about 1.5 feet of water level elevation reduction from installing all this natural infrastructure. And then on the main stem, there was just a modest peak flow reduction, so like 4% peak flow reduction. So really good for localized flooding if you're installing it at large scale, but not so much for that main stem flooding. This kind of gets to the point that natural infrastructure isn't kind of like the only thing you should be doing, right? It's just one tool in the toolbox, and we're never going to really prevent all flooding, because flooding in some cases can be good for ecosystems, but we want to reduce the impact on people and try and prevent that kind of widespread damage. So a couple of things that I want to share with y'all that we're kind of thinking about at EDF going forward are these 3 topics related to natural infrastructure. So climate accounting of these kind of novel practices, at least within North Carolina, how they treat water quality, and then financial tools to promote the adoption of natural infrastructure. So how do we go to farmers and say, hey, we want to take, or if you let us, we want to put a giant berm around this giant crop field. Like, how do we promote that and make that okay? And so the reason that it's important to get an idea of the climate accounting of these structures is that aquatic ecosystems create about 50% of global methane emissions. And that's a big deal. So that's a lot of methane, which is a intense greenhouse gas. And so what is the net carbon impact? So like sequestration in the soils or vegetation and biomass versus what are they emitting in terms of methane, CO2, nitrous oxide. So if we can get a handle on that, then maybe we can design these structures or manage them in order to maximize the beneficial climate impact that they might have. And so the graph right here that I've highlighted, very hard to see, but basically if it's green or blue, then that's an aquatic methane source. And when you stack it all together, it's about 52 to 53% of the total methane emissions. So secondly, can natural infrastructure be effective for water quality improvement and flood mitigation? So actually putting some of these projects in the ground, measuring their impact on nitrogen removal, phosphorus removal, sediment removal, all these kind of water quality indicators that we're interested in. How effective are they? And then what, if any, are there trade-offs between the carbon removal, water quality, and flood mitigation? So these are kind of some important questions because carbon sequestration and water quality, maybe there's some trade-offs there between different types of water quality parameters you're measuring. So just some important things to consider. And then finally, a lack of proven financial tools that have been used successfully in North Carolina to promote the uptake of natural infrastructure. And I just want to highlight this new report through another EDF group, the Climate Resilient Agricultural Group. They looked at different financial practices to promote natural infrastructure within the Mississippi River Basin. And there's a link to it in the bottom left if you want to go check it out. But they recommended 5 different financial tools that could be useful within the Mississippi River Basin and beyond. But another question is, what are the physical and financial impacts of natural infrastructure on cropland? So if we're designing like a water farm, how often are we going to have flooding on that water farm, and what does that mean for what's growing in that area? So those kind of more specific questions related to North Carolina's climate and kind of the design of these structures. Okay, so my 3 takeaways are that the North Carolina Flood Resiliency Blueprint, it will help prioritize projects and also provide a decision support tool to help increase local planning capacity. Also, natural infrastructure is just one effective tool to help mitigate flood impacts, but it's important to remember that the impacts are localized and it's not a kind of a one-size-fits-all. It's not going to be the only thing that we want to do in order to limit flooding, destructive flooding. And then finally, there's some more research that we need to help improve the widespread adoption of natural infrastructure, and also to figure out how to maximize the investment in natural infrastructure for the most bang for your buck, I guess you can put it. And if you'd like to email me, or if you want to tweet as well, if anyone's into live tweeting, you can tag me down here. But I'd be happy to take any questions, and if I don't get a chance to talk with you now, just find me outside in the hallway and love to chat. Thanks.
Thank you. That was an awesome presentation. Questions from the audience? Any burning questions on your minds? Hey, it is now.
No burning questions. No, I'm just kidding.
The flood storage area, I'm just curious about how that works on a couple of counts. One is they're taking that out of production, so it seems they need to be compensated somehow. So and I know you talked about the financial, but I'm curious how that would work. The other thing is I wonder is the frequency of which you would actually utilize that. I mean, how often would flooding occur that you would actually use that? So could it be used for crop production when there's not flooding, but then have the compensation kick in almost like an insurance policy when it was used for flood storage? So anyway, I'm just playing with the numbers.
Sure. Yeah, great questions. Okay, so the first one, well, just kind of to address both of them. So we have thought about the idea of like a flood insurance rider, so something related to flood insurance, but that's a little tricky because you can't necessarily like intentionally flood your cropland and then still be like within the flood insurance policy, because it's not like a best farming practice for some reason. But yeah, so maybe outside the crop insurance realm, there's some different financial tools, and maybe it's like mitigation credits related to carbon or nutrients. So that's one idea. I think Barbara Dahl did a lot of this work, and her group did. So if she's in the room, maybe she could answer this. But I believe it's like 20 to 50 year flood is kind of like the design of these storms to be captured on like water farming parcels. And it was, I believe that the suitability analysis was for like low yield cropland. And so I think they're typically pasture or some other crop already. So kind of like a lower, maybe lower value crop. Because if it gets flooded, they can't sell any food growing on that land. So yeah, it's kind of an open question, I guess, how to plant those fields, how often will they flood in a changing climate, and then how do we compensate the farmers? Probably not through crop insurance, though. Yeah.
Gotcha, Frank.
After all this talk about water, I guess this wouldn't be a really burning question because it would be extinguished pretty quickly. But two things: is the image that you had of water farming, was that somewhere in North Carolina now? And I guess the other thing, if we're looking at rainfall and rainfall is getting heavy in between long periods of drought, is that an easier way to convince someone to do water farming because you're going to be needing water down the road and for a period of drought?
Yeah, so for the first question, that rendering, it was, I think, originally from the collaboratory report, I believe through Barbara Dahl's group, and I'm not sure, I believe it was a North Carolina field, but it was just a rendering, so not actually undergoing that. And then one idea that we've heard for water farming is to build a farm pond and then use that as like a borrow pit to create the earthen berm, and then use that farm pond as irrigation water. And I know that I believe Chad Poole at NC State is currently doing a project focused on farm pond water reuse. And so I believe that is kind of an opportunity. But again, questions related to kind of the greenhouse gas emissions from farm ponds. But from what I can tell, it seems like it is good for water reuse, and the farmers like it, and it uses up excess nitrogen. So yeah, that's basically farm ponds make the water or water farming berms, and then you kind of have water when you need it for drought, but then storage for flooding.
Got time for another question if anyone has anything in mind. feel like I should have a theme song every time I travel across the room.
Thank you so much, Adam. Susan White. Do you all, or in your growth portfolio, since you're new with EDF, work with the Army Corps' Engineering with Nature group, looking at natural nature-based infrastructure for flood?
So at the moment, I don't think so. But again, I'm only a month in, so I'll have to double check, but I can double check on that for you if you'd like. Thank you.
All right, let's give it up for Adam.
Thank you.
All right, last but not least, we have Mallory Eastland with the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative, or SASMI, as it's affectionately known. She'll be telling you all about Marsh and Forward, which is my favorite project slogan, by the way, by far.
Thanks. It was heavily workshopped. Had to get a good pun. Hi, so I'm Mallory Eastland, and I'm the coordinator for the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative. And today I'm going to talk to y'all a little bit about the partnerships, process, and research that got us to where we are today with the initiative and where it's taking us into the future. So as you probably deduced, we're working to conserve the South Atlantic salt marsh. In addition to just being a gorgeous landscape, it has a lot of ecological and economical benefits, not to mention the cultural, recreational, and intrinsic value of the marsh. The presenters that went before me have done a great job of setting the stage of some of the pressures that our coast is under, and the South Atlantic salt marsh isn't any different. So we're kind of looking at the area we're working to conserve. The map on y'all's right shows the salt marsh where it is. So our range is from the tip of North Carolina down to northeast Florida, to the Brevard County line, actually. And all of that encapsulates approximately 1 million acres of salt marsh. So it's an incredible interconnected landscape, one of the last great vast stretches of salt marsh in the US and in the world. So again, it's just really, really important, and we have a lot of great partners working to conserve this. On your right, I hope it's your right, we have some models, some sea level rise predictions. So that's just kind of showing the pressures that we're looking at and what we're trying to get ahead of and prepare for now. So this is a North Carolina map showing a little bit more specific of what we're looking, how we're preparing for the migration space. And then also some military installation ranges and training areas, as well as sentinel landscapes, which are some pretty big drivers of natural resource conservation. So our initiative started in May 2021, so I'm going to be summarizing about 1.5 years of progress. Partnership is one of the largest drivers of this initiative. We are a voluntary, non-regulatory partnership. We have a diverse steering committee of about 40 people that help guide us throughout this process. Our coalition is really what we call our group of stakeholders that are actively engaged with the initiative. It's about 300, it grows all of the time. We've been so lucky. I've been really lucky to be involved in this partnership of just how many people are passionate and want to be in the loop, want to help us with this initiative. So I can't emphasize enough that partnership is really what drives this effort and has led to our success so far. There's a list of stakeholders. I always leave something out because, again, it is extremely diverse, which is a great thing. That map there, those red dots, actually represents military installations and training grounds. So as you can see, that's another driver for the coast. And most of these installations or training grounds are next to very bustling towns and cities. So the guiding principles of our initiative are up there. I'm going to talk a little bit about our conservation plan, which is what we're working towards now, which is going to be framework and catalyst for implementation in the future. But again, it's really the partnerships, collaboration, and the research that drive this and are giving us the platform to do amazing work that hopefully continues on for decades and decades. Our goal right now, and this has been heavily workshopped with our steering committee, and what we've finally landed on after 1.5 years, is to maintain at minimum the current level of productivity and extent of the approximate 1 million acres of salt marsh. And that's further broke down into these 3 separate strategies, which simply are to conserve what we have, protect what we have now, restore degraded salt marsh, and then prepare for migration in the future. There's going to be migration of the salt marsh due to the inevitable sea level rise. So protecting what we have and preparing to where it's going to be in the future. This slide is to emphasize the America's Longleaf Restoration Initiative. This was a very successful landscape scale initiative that we modeled our efforts after. So I know there's a couple students in the room, so don't write this down, but we plagiarized this heavily and then adapted it to our needs. It's been a great model. Obviously, the salt marsh is a lot different than forested just because of sea level rise, but it's really helped us get to where we are today. So highly suggest looking into that. Here's a very simplified path that we have to our regional conservation plan. A workshop was one of the first things we started working towards. This was instrumental in the America's Longleaf Plan and how they set up their conservation plan. Again, one of our big efforts is to be really stakeholder driven. So how do you bring together 300 people and create a conservation plan where everyone feels like they've been a part of it and that we're getting all of the right subject matter experts to the table? Our approach was a workshop. And so this was in March of, 2022, I guess, time flies. So we did this virtually just due to some of the difficulties of meeting in person at that time. After the workshop, and this is what we've been doing for the past several months, we have a writing team that's been working to create a draft plan. Our review process involves our entire coalition. So again, that's about 300 people. We're asking, hey, we invited you to attend this workshop. You gave us lots of good feedback. Can you review this plan and make sure that everything we talked about was incorporated? And also, you know a lot more about for me, everything, but about like some of these subject matter experts areas than others. So can you comment on that specifically? Of course, revision back and forth. And our big goal is having the conservation plan formally launched in March 2023. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about our workshop because this was kind of our ground zero for incorporating research into this process. It was a virtual workshop over a full week. It was 5 days. I actually had to redo that count for our conservation plan. It was actually 170 people, a little bit over, that actually participated. And for that workshop, we explored these different broad topics we called workshop topics, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the goal of this was to build the foundation of our conservation plan so that a writing team could take everything we've learned to date after and throw it together in a plan, which again, super simplified version of the process that we've gone through. So in preparation for that workshop, and it was months and months and months of preparation, our steering committee helped us identify these 8 different workshop topics. So they're really pretty broad from what you can see there. And for each of these topics, there was a team that was, there was leaders that were appointed by the steering committee, and then those leaders built out their team of subject matter experts. And again, over a couple of months, they put together basically white papers, very condensed versions of their subject matter expertise for each of these broad topics. And those were distributed prior to the workshop for review. So at the workshop, we could really get into focused discussion about these topics. I'll also add to, like, in addition to these topics, we had a couple of just like overarching lens that we view the conservation plan with, and want to emphasize because they came up a lot with the discussion with our partners, and that's just that we also want built into the framework of our plan is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and environmental justice. So those are also kind of like the not listed lens that we look through this all the time. Yeah, I think that's good on the workshop. Oh, I'll add too, so our workshop, a little bit of presentations, but it was mostly like 54 different sessions of breakout groups that were focused on each topic. So participants could sign up for those that they were interested in. Some of them, hey, I'm a mapping expert, I'm just going to mapping. And other people were like, I'm going to go to all 8, which was great. We had a lot of really good contact come out of there. So our writing team, which we have someone who has full-time effort leading that team, and then some of the topic team leads from those stayed on to help write this plan. They've pulled together that plan, and I'm going to give you all a little bit of a preview of what it's looking like now. So we come back to, guiding force is our goal, and we've also broken out into these 3 core strategies, and underneath each strategy, we have objectives, different objectives, and key actions within those. As well as strategies, we have our cross-cutting approaches, and that ended up being things like policy, mapping, cultural resources and community and interconnectivity, which again, just totally cross-cutting. And there's objectives and associated key actions with all of those. And then implementation is really our next step. I mentioned earlier, but this plan is meant to be a framework and catalyst, really, really focused on implementation. So end goal, like many plans, we do not want this to be something that just sits on a desk, people look at once or twice. It's supposed to kind of launch us into implementation, which is what we're planning for now. And as soon as we kind of have this live, we want implementation to start right away, which is looking very much like that's going to happen thanks to all of our really great and super involved partners. So that's my really quick overview of everything that we've been doing. I cannot emphasize enough how important our partnerships are. If there's anyone in this room that has any more questions or think that your organization would be a great fit, or you just want to stay in the loop, please come talk to me afterwards. If you can't read my email, I can give you my information after this, but really appreciate y'all's time and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Mallory. Any questions for Mallory? And then, I told our speakers here today to try to keep it short, just building in some contingency, but everyone did fabulously on time. So we've got some time at the end for questions for everyone, if anything else has come to mind as well. But I figure we'll take the next several minutes and see if there's anything specifically on SASME.
Hey, Mallory, thanks for that great presentation. So with 300 stakeholders and 40 steering committee members, how do y'all reach consensus on priorities?
Great question. We usually try to do that at a steering committee level, which hasn't to date been super difficult. And if it is, we usually will loop back to it, and for those who are really opinionated, we're like, great, now you're part of a small sub-team that's going to discuss this further and bring it back. So it's a lot of wrangling cats, but like I said, it's been really great working for this initiative because everyone is more or less on the same page about the big issues. So it hasn't, knock on wood, been super challenging yet, but we usually try to approach it from a steering committee based consensus. We also have monthly open coalition meetings where usually I'll give an update on general progress, big decisions, all that. And then we try to have some speakers, and we always leave room for open forum. So we also kind of default back to that as an opportunity for coalition members, come say what you need to say. If you've got an issue, we can discuss it. And that's actually been really helpful. And we've made a lot of good decisions or kind of powered through some difficult conversations in that broader context. So we're just trying to build in as many opportunities for engagement. And like I said, just keeping it a focus to create this community and being clear that we are stakeholder driven.
Can you give us an example of some of the implementation projects that you have in the plan? Just a few highlights here and there?
I'll do the best off my memory. And it's a regional level plan. So I will say that it's pretty broad because we're making recommendations that are relevant to North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, which all have very different, just a lot of different stuff going on, different considerations, different bureaucracies. So in those, the objectives and key actions don't go super detailed, but a part of a post-implementation plan, we plan on having breakout goals and stuff that are SMART goals where we're saying exactly what we're going to do. Some examples of implementation though, like nature-based solutions, living shorelines. I don't know, it's also so broad. So we also have some like cultural and community focused objectives. And it's also been things that we've identified like over the past year and a half that it's like, oh, we haven't done this yet, but this is certainly an area we need to improve on. And even some part of implementation is just preparing for capacity as well. So it's really, really broad. But if you're interested, happy to talk more about it. And if you're not a part of the coalition, you can be, and you can get a preview of that plan next week. It's going out.
Oh, yeah, my question was kind of a more vague version of that last question. So I think you kind of answered parts of it, but I'll say it anyway. That like map you showed at the very beginning of just like the sheer scale of this initiative really amazed me. But it also like signaled like the importance of things like habitat connectivity for like, for example, migratory marine species. I guess my question is really like, how do you deal with like the tension between that need for like very broad like regional kind of like habitat and also habitat connectivity and also like having to deal with like state specific or like locally specific issues and how like cross state priorities might conflict like based on like different kinds of like policies each state might have?
Yeah, that's a great question. My first answer to that is that, again, very fortunate to have had the America's Longleaf Restoration Initiative, which I think is like, they just had their 15th year anniversary. So to know that their models worked and it's been successful. And so we're kind of coming from the regional approach and then paring down. Some of what their plan did was have this more broad regional plan, and then part of their implementation was breaking into local implementation teams that really focused on the local issues and were dealing more with like, you know, kind of local agencies and organizations. We're going to follow a model similar to that. And then this is the other part of my answer that makes it easy. It's like, we're still figuring all that out. It's, you know, it's adapting based on feedback and what our partners are saying. So we will likely be taking that approach. And through this process, it's become clear the states do differ a lot. And one of our goals is like, there was need for cross-state communication with, I think we've helped accomplish a lot more communication, but the states are so different. So we are taking a little bit more of a state focus for implementation and really taking into account the separate states' goals. Like some states are further along than others with their conservation efforts. So a lot of that's just been adapting the more we learn, and when states are, you know, expressing their needs and limitations to us, adapting to that. So it's kind of a constant challenge and something we, you know, tweak along the way. But ultimately having the model of America's Longleaf and starting from this like top-down approach of looking at it regionally, identifying this is one interconnected ecosystem. We need to all work together, because you can't just like save a small part and, you know, be like, great, that's good to go, because it's, again, extremely interconnected. So starting everyone being like, regionally, this makes sense. And then they're able to parse down into state and then more local, and then do communication, cross communication at that level.
We can absolutely take more questions. I actually have a question. So Mallory, I feel like it's probably a good lead in. So with the America's Longleaf Pine initiative, it seemed like that one approach to that was that it involved a lot of large scale landowners, and marsh migration seems like a whole different animal in a lot of ways, because you are engaging so many shoreline property owners, which are much smaller and more granular. Was there a way, when you were thinking about using that as a model for SASME, that was a part of the discussion in addressing that challenge?
Yeah, it's still part of the discussion, and we're still addressing that challenge, because it's also very different, because the states technically own the salt marsh here. So when we're thinking about landowners, we're thinking more about migration corridors and how to help prepare them for migration corridors. But for some of the state agencies, particularly South Carolina and Georgia, that can get a little sticky and political, just because like states own the salt marsh and landowners don't may not be clear on where their property line ends. So all that to say of like, we're very much still considering it and still talking about it. But we've had a lot of good engagement with landowners in not just the salt marsh, but kind of the coastal boundaries. And that is one of our like longer term objectives, is like engagement and working on communication with landowners and kind of continuing to parse that out and make sure, you know, that's another like relationship building aspect, is like landowners and state agencies have an understanding of, you know, what each other's trying to do and each other's needs, issues, etc.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mallory? All right, awesome. Round of applause.
Thanks.
Well, that closes us out for our 4 speakers today. We have some time left if anyone has any other questions for any of the other speakers. So please feel free to raise a hand or come up or whatever makes sense. But if not, we have come in under the line, under the time limit. Not too shabby, better than over, as I always say. Thanks for coming.